Hello, you are on the channel The Truths of Life. And let me ask you a question that you may never have stopped to really face. And when it seems that the sky is closed, is God still listening? When you pray, you insist. You wait, but nothing changes. No sign, no clear answer, just silence. A heavy, uncomfortable silence that makes faith shake and the heart wonder if something has gone wrong along the way. This feeling is not new. It crosses generations. Stories, entire pages of the Bible. Men and women who believed in God obeyed, walked with him, and yet they faced periods when heaven seemed distant, locked away, inaccessible. Times when there were no prophets speaking, miracles happening, or answers coming down from on high. Just wait, just doubt, just faith being tested to the limit. Maybe you're experiencing something similar right now. A phase in which everything seems to stand still. Life does not advance. Doors do not open. Prayers seem to hit the ceiling and return. And the question that echoes inside is always the same. Where is God? This questioning, although many are afraid to admit it, is profoundly human. And more than that, it is profoundly biblical. The Bible does not hide God's silence. On the contrary, it reveals it. She shows that there are times when silence is not abandonment, but preparation. It is not absence, but invisible work. But when we are inside the process, this is almost never easy to see. Silence hurts. It confuses. It weakens. And, at the same time, it reveals what really exists within us. Today, we are going to walk through this topic calmly. No ready-made answers. No empty phrases. No spiritual shortcuts. Let's look at scripture, biblical history, and human experience with honesty. Let's understand why, at certain times, the sky seems closed and what God might be doing just when everything seems too quiet. You may find that silence does not mean rejection. You may realize that waiting has a greater purpose than we imagine. Or maybe this video just puts words into something you feel but have never been able to explain. In any case, this journey is not about cold religion, but about living faith, about real pain, about hope being molded in the most unlikely place. And before we move on, let me tell you something important. If you've ever felt forgotten, if you've ever thought that God took too long, if you've ever lived through a time when everything seemed to stand still, you're not alone. Many of the Bible's greatest stories begin just like this, with heaven closed and hearts filled with questions. That's exactly where everything starts to make sense. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Before continuing, let me make you a quick but sincere request. If this topic has already touched you in any way, leave the like now. This helps this message to reach people who are also living this silence. Comment below if you've ever gone through a time when praying seemed to have no answer. I read all the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel, because here we walk together, reflecting the Word of God in a deep and true way. When praying hurts more than being silent, something very deep is happening inside us, because praying, in theory, should relieve. It should bring peace, hope, direction. But there are times when prayer seems to only open the wound even more. You kneel, you speak, you cry, you repeat the same words, the same requests, and nothing happens. No clear answer, no sign, no visible change. And then a feeling arises that is hard to admit. Silence begins to feel less painful than continuing to speak to an unresponsive sky. It is at this point that many people get lost inside, because the problem is not just waiting, it's the feeling of being ignored. It is the impression that his words do not go beyond the ceiling, that your faith is being put to the test not by external attacks, but by the absence of response. And that is tiring. Tires the soul, it's hard, it cheats hopey. Gradually, prayer ceases to be a refuge and becomes a confrontation with one's own fear that God is not listening. Maybe you've experienced it. Maybe I'm living now. You've been praying for the same thing for weeks, months, years, sometimes for an answer, for a direction, for a change that never comes. And, in the background, a dangerous, silent question begins to arise, which many do not have the courage to verbalize. Is there any point in continuing to pray? This question is not born of a lack of faith, but of an excess of pain. It is born when hope has been stretched to the limit. The Bible does not ignore this feeling. It does not romanticize the pain of those who pray in silence. On the contrary, it records anguished cries, broken prayers, words spoken through tears, people who kept praying even when praying hurt, even when it seemed to make no sense, even when everything inside them screamed to give up. What many people don't realize is that this pain point is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is a sign of depth. Only those who take faith seriously feel this kind of conflict. There is a huge difference between the silence of those who have never spoken to God and the silence of those who have spoken again, insisted, and heard nothing in response. This second silence hurts more because it is born from a relationship. It is born of expectation. It is born of trust. And when that trust doesn't get an immediate return, the heart goes into conflict. You begin to wonder if you are praying wrong, if you have done something wrong, if God has changed, or if you have changed. And that's exactly where many are silent. Not because they have stopped believing, but because they are tired of talking without an answer. Silence, in this case, becomes a form of emotional protection. Talk less to hurt less, wait less to suffer less. But that kind of silence also carries guilt. Guilt for not praying as before, guilt for feeling distant, guilt for not being able to maintain the same intensity of faith as in other times. What almost no one tells you is that this conflict is part of the spiritual journey, that there are phases in which prayer is not light, it is heavy. It's not comfortable, it's painful. It does not bring immediate relief, but it reveals what is hidden within us. Prayer, in these moments, does not change the sky, it exposes the heart. And that scares us, because it forces us to face our doubts, our fears, and our real dependence on God. Perhaps the problem is not that God is not listening. Perhaps the problem is that we are going through a kind of silence that precedes something greater. A silence that does not mean absence, but preparation. A silence that is not punishment, but a process. But before you understand this, you have to face the pain of continuing to talk when everything around you seems too quiet. Because this point, this uncomfortable place where praying hurts more than being silent, is usually the beginning of profound transformations that we have not yet been able to see. When the Bible speaks of heaven closed, it is not using any poetic expression. This term appears, directly or indirectly, at various times in Scripture to describe periods when God seemed silent, distant, with no visible manifestations. It is not a total absence of faith, nor a lack of God in the world. It is something more specific and, at the same time, more disturbing. It is when the people continue to exist, to live, to breathe, but he does not perceive the voice of God as before. Interestingly, the Bible never treats closed heaven as something rare or strange. Rather, it presents it as part of the relationship between God and human beings. There are times of spiritual abundance, of miracles, of clear signs, and there are times when the sky closes, in which there are no prophets speaking, visions happening, answers coming down from on high. Just silence, just wait, just faith being tested in the dark. One of the most well-known examples is when the people of Israel lived long periods without hearing a direct word from God. There was no new prophecy, there was no clear direction, there were no extraordinary signs. Still, God had not ceased to exist, nor to rule. The closed sky did not mean that God had gone away, but that he was acting in a different way, a way that was not comfortable, nor easy to understand. The Bible also associates closed heaven with moments of spiritual and moral crisis. In several passages, God's silence appears as a consequence of a withdrawal from the human heart, not as divine abandonment. It is as if God allowed silence to reveal something deeper, the real state of people's faith, obedience, and dependence. When all is well, it is easy to say that you trust God, but when heaven closes, what is left is the truth of the heart. At the same time, the closed sky is not presented only as a discipline. In some cases, it is as preparation. Before great changes, liberations, new beginnings, there is silence, as if God is setting the stage working behind the scenes, preparing people and circumstances for something that cannot yet be revealed. The problem is that those who are living in silence do not see the backstage. He only feels the absence. And here's something important. The Bible never says that closed heaven is permanent. It always has a beginning, middle, and end. There always comes a moment when the silence is broken, the voice is heard again, the direction reappears. But until that moment comes, there is a difficult interval to cross. An interval in which faith needs to exist without applause, without immediate responses, without visible signs. Perhaps the most curious thing is to realize that closed heaven does not choose only weak people or people who are far from God. It reaches leaders, prophets, men and women deeply connected to the faith. This breaks the idea that spiritual silence is always a sign of personal error. Sometimes, it's a sign that something bigger is being built outside of our field of vision. Understanding what the Bible calls closed heaven changes the way we deal with silence. It is no longer just a problem to be solved and becomes a stage to be crossed. A stage that carries questions, discomfort and uncertainty, but also a purpose that has not yet been fully revealed. And to understand why this silence exists, we need to look more closely at what happens inside us when the sky seems unresponsive. There is a silent pattern that runs through the entire Bible and that many people only notice after looking closely. Before God acts publicly, he is usually silent. Before the call becomes visible, there is a time when nothing seems to happen. Before the voice is heard by many, there is a period when silence dominates the story. This silence is not empty. It is loaded with intention, even if, for those who are living, it seems only abandonment. Our expectation is almost always the opposite. We hope that God will speak first, give clear signs, open paths, confirm everything. And only then comes the call. But in Scripture, the movement is usually reversed. God watches, God waits, God allows silence, and only then does he act. This silent interval is precisely what separates the human impulse from the divine purpose. Many of the great biblical callings did not begin with lights, voices, or miracles. They started with waiting, with anonymity, with years in which no one knew what was being prepared. Silence precedes sending. Anonymity precedes the mission. Concealment precedes revelation. And this completely breaks the human logic, which associates value with visibility and importance with immediate recognition. When the sky is silent, it's easy to think that nothing is happening. But biblically, this is where the foundations are being built. God works, first on the character before acting through the person. It molds, adjusts, corrects, deflates wrong expectations, because an unprepared call can destroy those who receive it. And silence is one of the most profound tools of this preparation. This pattern appears repeatedly. Men and women who have gone through long periods of silence before living what they were called to do. It was not punishment. It was not forgetting. It was a process. But while they are inside it, these people do not know it. They only feel the absence of answers, the delay, the feeling that life is at a standstill. This is where the story begins to connect with Moses in a natural way. Before he was the liberator, before he faced pharaohs, before he saw the sea part, there was a long silence. A silence that did not happen after the call, but before. A silence that prepared the man who would carry a mission to great for someone not treated inside. Moses did not emerge ready. It was built in silence. And understanding this completely changes the way we see the periods when God seems silent. Because maybe the sky is not closed to prevent something, but to prepare someone. And when we look closely at the story of Moses before the desert, we begin to realize that this silence had a much deeper purpose than we imagined. And it is exactly to this point that the narrative takes us now. Moses already carried something inside him before any direct word from God. He was not an ordinary man in the sense of living without internal conflicts. There was a constant tension between who he was on the outside and who he felt he was on the inside. Raised in the palace, educated as a prince of Egypt, surrounded by power, privileges, and influence, but with a cracked identity inside. He knew he didn't totally belong there. Hebrew blood flowed through his veins, even though his garments were Egyptian. This internal conflict generates something dangerous and, at the same time, very human. The feeling of a call without direction. Moses perceives the injustice against his people, feels indignation, feels urgency, feels that something needs to be done, but it has no clear instruction from heaven. There is no audible voice. There is no confirmation. There is no order, just an internal feeling that it's not right. And when the sky remains silent, the human being tends to fill this silence with his own hands. This is exactly what happens. Moses acts. He sees an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew and, moved by the mixture of revolt, sense of justice, and perhaps a confused idea of mission, he interferes, kill the Egyptian. It was not just an impulsive act. It was an attempt to solve something that God had not yet authorized in the arm. Moses tried to anticipate the purpose. He tried to be a deliverer without being sent. He tried to fulfill a call that had not yet been officially delivered. And the result is devastating. Instead of recognition comes fear. Instead of support comes rejection. The people themselves ask, "Who made you prince and judge over us?" That question echoes deeper than it seems, because it reveals a painful truth. Moses felt he had a calling, but no one else saw it. Heaven did not confirm it. People didn't recognize it, and God's silence continued. This is one of the most difficult points of the spiritual journey. When you feel something burning inside, but find no answer on the outside. When there is a desire to do something great, right, fair, but everything around it freezes. Moses discovers, in the worst possible way, that good intentions are no substitute for divine direction, and that acting ahead of time can turn a possible instrument of God into a fugitive, not because he missed his calling, but because the mistake brought consequences. The silence that was once just the absence of response now becomes distance, isolation, exile. Moses leaves the palace not as a deliverer, but as one who has failed. Heaven has not spoken before. And now, after the mistake, the silence seems even heavier. This moment marks a profound turn, because the man who has tried to act without listening to God will need to learn something he does not yet know. That silence also teaches that the absence of response does not mean the absence of care, and that, many times, God allows the person to exhaust his own strength before revealing the right path. It is exactly at this point that the story begins to shift. From the impulse to the process, from the rush to the waiting, from the noise of the palace to a much deeper kind of silence that is about to begin. When heaven is silent, there is an almost invisible temptation that settles in the human heart, that of acting so as not to feel still. Waiting hurts. Waiting is tiring. Waiting makes us wonder if we heard God correctly, if we understood everything wrong, if we are wasting time while the world moves on. And it is exactly at this point that many decisions are made not by direction, but by anxiety. Moses did not err because he was bad, nor because he lacked love for his people. He made a mistake because he acted without an answer. And acting without an answer almost always seems like courage, until the result appears. Moses' mistake did not defeat the purpose, but delayed the process. This is important to understand. God did not give up on him at that moment, but the path that could have been direct became long, painful, and lonely. A single decision made in silence, without confirmation, was enough to completely change the scenario of his life. From the palace to the desert, from status to anonymity, from maybe I'm somebody to now, I need to flee to survive. This pattern is repeated to this day. How many people make important decisions because they can't bear to wait anymore? They change paths, break relationships, make spiritual and emotional choices just to ease the pain of silence. The absence of a response becomes a justification for acting, and the problem is not to act. It is to act without being sent, because when God has not yet spoken, any movement outside the right time exacts a price. Moses wanted to free him, but ended up hurting him. He wanted to protect, but he generated fear. He wanted to do justice, but he produced chaos. All this because the heart was ahead of the direction. And here is a truth. that is hard to swallow. Not all good intentions come at the right time. Not every sense of urgency comes from God. Sometimes, silence is precisely the protection against a greater error. When Moses flees, he doesn't just flee from Egypt. He runs away from his own frustration. He realizes that he has tried to be that which God had not yet officially revealed. And this generates a kind of deep pain, because now he has to live with the feeling of having ruined everything. How many people today carry that same weight? The feeling of if only I had waited longer, if only I had done this, if only I had heard better. But here's the bottom line. Delaying is not destroying. The purpose did not die, but was pushed into a scenario where Moses would need to be rebuilt from within. God allows some decisions in silence to take us to unexpected places, not as a final punishment, but as part of a corrective process. The problem is that, in the midst of this, everything seems like loss. It looks like punishment. It seems to be the end. And that's exactly where most give up spiritually, because error generates shame. Shame generates distancing, and the distance makes the silence seem even greater. Moses now does not hear God, sees no signs, has no direction, and carries a past that weighs him down. But this delay is about to become an environment of deep preparation, even if he doesn't know it yet. If this part of the story already speaks to something you have lived or live now, write the word "I waited" in the comments, so we know you've seen this far. There is a moment in the spiritual journey when we need to confront one of the most painful lies that God's silence produces, the idea of abandonment. When heaven seems closed, the heart quickly concludes that it has been forgotten, rejected, or cast aside. But the Bible shows something very different. In many cases, silence is not disregard, it is deepest form of care he can offer in that moment, because speaking ahead of time can destroy us more than silence. With Moses, the closed heaven did not mean that God had given up on him. On the contrary, it meant that God was preventing Moses from being lost for good. If God had responded at that moment, if he had reaffirmed the call right after the mistake, Moses would probably have continued to try to deliver Israel with human strength, position, and momentum. Silence was a barrier, a spiritual security lock, an invisible protection. Sometimes God is silent not because you've messed up too much, but because you're not yet ready to hear what he wants to say. The answer exists, but if it is delivered now, it will be misinterpreted, misused, or turned into pride, anxiety, or haste. The closed sky preserves. It prevents the promise from being touched by hands that are still immature. In the wilderness, Moses loses everything that defined him externally: name, status, social identity. And this does not happen by chance. While the sky is closed, God is dismantling the ego, not the call. It is treating the interior, not erasing the future. Silence becomes a space where God works without applause, without an audience, and without human interference. This is the kind of process that hurts because it can't be explained. There are no clear signs. There are no visible confirmations. There is no sense of progress. But there is something going on. There always is. The problem is that the human heart confuses noise with movement and silence with stagnation, and God works in the opposite way. Often, the greatest spiritual breakthrough happens when nothing seems to be moving. The closed sky also protects you from yourself. It protects from impulsive decisions, from dangerous shortcuts, from misinterpretations of one's calling. How many times does God not answer because he knows you would use the answer to hurt yourself? How many closed doors are actually silent deliverances? Moses didn't know it, but while he thought he was being forgotten in the wilderness, God was assuring him that when the sky opened again, he would no longer be the same man who tried to act alone. Silence was forming someone who would know how to listen, obey, and wait. And that changes everything. There is a silent idea that hurts many people in the faith, that if we don't feel anything, then nothing is happening. As if the presence of God always had to be accompanied by emotion, shivers, visible signs, or immediate responses. But the Bible forcefully dismantles this logic in most of the deeper stories. God is working at exactly the times when no one feels anything at all. Neither joy, nor confirmation, nor clear direction. Just routine. Just wait. Only silence. The problem is that we have been taught to measure God by what we feel, not by what He is forming. Emotion is noticeable, character is not. Inner transformation is slow, invisible, and often uncomfortable. While we wait for something great to happen on the outside, God is doing something decisive on the inside. And this is almost never accompanied by a good feeling. Moses spends years living the same days. No new revelation, no supernatural sign, no audible reminder that he was still chosen. If he had depended on what he felt, he would have concluded that it was all over. But this is precisely where God is working most deeply, not in power, but in temperament, not in the mission, but in the identity, not in the liberation of Israel, but in the rebuilding of the man who would lead that liberation. God works in silence because silence reveals who we are when we are not being watched, praised, or rewarded. It is there that faith ceases to be excitement and becomes conviction. It is there that pride loses space, that haste is confronted, that the heart learns to obey without understanding everything. When we feel nothing, we have no choice but to continue or give up, and that choice shapes who we become. The closed sky creates an environment where you cannot rely on spiritual sensations. Only the truth remains. All that remains is perseverance. All that remains is the daily decision to continue even without feeling like it. And this is extremely formative. God is more interested in who you are becoming than in what you are feeling right now. While Moses is tending sheep, something invisible is happening. Impulsiveness is being broken. Arrogance is being replaced by meekness. The man who killed an Egyptian on impulse is learning to wait. The leader who tried to act alone is being prepared to listen to instructions. None of this generates emotion, but all this generates transformation. Maybe today you are living this strange phase in which you don't feel God near. You don't feel God far away. You just don't feel anything. No clear answer, no strong confirmation, no visible breakthrough. But that doesn't mean God has stopped. It could mean that He is working on such a deep level that it cannot yet be perceived, because what God does in the invisible sustains everything that will one day appear in the visible. What if what you call punishment is actually a sign? What if the closed sky is not God punishing you, but protecting you from something you can't yet see? This question changes everything because it directly affects the way we interpret silence. Most people, when they receive no response, quickly conclude that they have made a mistake, that they have disappointed God, or that they have been cast aside. But the Bible shows a very different pattern. Often, silence does not come after error. It comes before the fulfillment. God does not close the sky to destroy. He closes to align. If He spoke at the wrong time, you would act with the wrong force, in the wrong way, for the wrong motivations. The closed sky prevents hasty movements, emotional decisions, and steps that would further delay the purpose. Silence hurts, but it also filters. He reveals who trusts God for who He is, and who only trusts when he receives something in return. Moses could have interpreted those years as rejection. I could have thought, God has forgotten me. The call was imagination. I am no longer the same. But without realizing it, the closed sky was freeing Moses from repeating the same mistake on a larger scale. If God had spoken too soon, Moses would have tried to deliver Israel with human strength again. Silence was a barrier to spiritual security. In our lives, it happens the same. There are doors that do not open because, if they opened now, they would crush us. There are answers that don't come because they would give us a false sense of control. There are periods when God is silent precisely because we are learning to listen. Closed heaven does not mean that God has left. It can mean that He is closer than ever, watching who you become when no one applauds you and when nothing happens the way you expected. Maybe you're at that exact point, praying, waiting, doing what's right, but feeling like nothing changes. And the temptation is to think that God has turned His face. But what if, in fact, He is preparing you for something that only makes sense later? What if this silence is the last adjustment before a change that requires maturity, humility, and depth that is still being formed. When heaven seems closed, our faith is refined. He stops, depending on signs, and starts to rely on the truth. And that transforms everything, because when God finally speaks, those who have gone through silence listen differently, obey differently, and walk differently. If this reflection speaks to what you are experiencing now, write the word sign in the comments. Sometimes, closed skies are not the end of the story. It is the exact point where it begins to change. Thank you for watching this far. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, The Truths of Life, and give your like to this video for the word to reach further and further.